Prior to international regulation, opium was one of the most traded commodities in the world, with major producing nations like India, Turkey, and China manufacturing and trading opium for popular commodities like tobacco, alcohol, tea, and coffee. The Netherlands was one of the first nations to initiate restrictions to opium in 1893 in their East Indian colony, now known as Indonesia. The Netherlands did not approve of their colony's farmers growing the cash crop and exporting the commodity to China. So to reduce production, the Netherlands created a state-controlled monopoly where they could control production, quality, and use while reducing the allowable limits to users. In addition, by 1895, the opioid revolution sparked when German pharmaceutical giant Bayer isolated and synthesized the pain-relieving morphine molecule found in opium into what was thought to be a non-addictive, manufactured, over-the-counter cough suppressant and pain reliever called heroin. Meanwhile, in China, the largest consumer of raw agricultural opium often found itself at the center of opium trade, with producing nations, particularly Great Britain via their colony India, pushing opium imports into the Chinese nation in exchange for other goods. These producing nations were not compelled to restrict production because of economic reasons. Opium production provided stable income to families and was a tax revenue. If opium production stopped in India, Great Britain would have to raise taxes to make up for the loss. The Brits also determined that if they suddenly reduced production, they would lose their competitive edge because another producing nation like Turkey, or Persia, which is now Iran, or Siam, which is now Thailand, would take over India's production. But by 1907, other commodities began to increase in value above opium, causing Great Britain to change their mood towards the drug. China, also realizing their addiction issues, worked with Great Britain's colony of India to arrange what was called the 10-year agreement. The two nations would simultaneously reduce production by 10% per year over a 10-year period, while a British authority would inspect the two nations on their progress. Surprisingly, 5 years into the agreement, both countries had cut their production in half, with an understanding that reduced production did not cause panics among users. Unfortunately, the agreement did not sustain the full 10-year duration due to the fall of the Chinese Manchu dynasty and Japanese invasion, followed by World War I. But this agreement would serve as the principal reasoning for focusing on regulating narcotics by controlling the supply side via the production of drugs. The only problem was that the regulators never analyzed if the agreement actually reduced use. And what regulators failed to consider was the basic economics of substitution. If regulation created reduced supply of opium but no reduction in demand, the addicts simply substituted their purchase to an opiate that was easier to obtain, like stronger forms of newly isolated opiates like morphine, heroin, and codeine. But what about the United States? America was busy with the Spanish-American War, but when the U.S. gained control of the opium-ravaged Philippines in 1898, the U.S. entered the narcotic regulatory scene in a dominating fashion. The U.S. immediately saw vulnerable China as an opportunity to form an alliance for trade negotiations. So when the countries first met at the 1909 Opium Convention in Shanghai, the U.S. jumped on the opportunity to show goodwill to China by initiating opium trade restrictions unless it was for Western medical use. Conversely, Great Britain and India, not wanting to lose stake in their largely controlled opium market, argued that quasi-medical opium usage was also important. The Brits also determined that if they suddenly reduced production, they would lose their competitive edge because another producing nation like Turkey, or Persia, which is now Iran, or Siam, which is now Thailand, would take over India's production. Portugal, who had an opium-producing colony within an Indian province called Malwa and a trading port in Macau, China, also didn't want to lose stake in their opium market. Other countries like Germany, the Netherlands, and France had a medical stake in manufactured opiates and remained relatively quiet during the 1909 convention. Italy didn't mention much in terms of opium, but did express their concern towards rising use of hashish in their African colonies. Meanwhile, the other opium-producing countries of Siam, which is now Thailand, Persia, now Iran, and Austria-Hungary, really only participated to listen to the arguments, but did absolutely nothing to take steps in counteracting the problem until every producing nation agreed to reductions. And for Russia, well, Russia was using the poppy plant for industrial oils, not drugs, so they felt no need to reduce production. And even though Turkey was a major producing culprit, they refused altogether to even attend the convention. By 1912, the 13 participating countries reconvened, with the countries continuing to keep their belief systems intact. Only this time, Germany, the Netherlands, and France became more vocal, as Great Britain, in an attempt to deflect their opium production in India, began to bring up the need to also regulate manufactured drugs like cocaine, codeine, morphine, and heroin. Soon after the 1912 convention, World War I broke out, stalling narcotic regulatory efforts except in the US, where two men named Charles Brent and Hamilton Wright convinced all producing nations to participate in opium reductions, with the inclusion of the restrictions to be part of the World War I peace treaty. This inclusion forced the last remaining nations of Germany and Turkey to sign the convention. To top it off, Germany, reprimanded for World War I, was forced to reduce their manufactured drug production, giving a competitive advantage for manufactured opiates to the World War I allies of Great Britain, France, Italy, and America. Soon after, the US, realizing their lack of drug industry, initiated research and development within the drug space, based on Western medicine principles, patented medicines, and controlling narcotics by controlling supply. From this point forward, the US would become a dominating power in international negotiations, narcotic regulations, and manufactured drugs.